I've put this video together to tell the story of our rebuild of Seawings, our 1973 Townson Twilight 32 footer. To give you the background, she was built in 1973 in Fiberglassing by Alex Baxter. She is glass over double skin Kauri. When we bought her early last year, we knew she was going to need a significant amount of work. We knew there was soft decks and a few other issues with her. She was saleable at the time, and we did sail her for a few months before pulling her out in September last year. She was left on the hard stand for about 6 weeks while we went on a trip overseas, and when we came back we got seriously into the project of rebuilding her. As all these projects do, it turned out to be far more significant than we had originally planned. This video should tell you that story.
After putting her back in the water at Half Moon Bay, we sailed her for the next few months. Even with sails that in no way matched the description we were given, she proved to point beautifully and sail very nicely. There were a number of issues identified then, including a stiff rudder and a number of small technical issues that we picked up, which will come up later on in this story. But already she was proving to be a very nice boat and well worth the effort we were planning to put into her. After a few lovely sails, we brought her up the Tamaki River to the Panmure Yacht and Boating Club, where we nosed her into a cradle and she was made fast and pulled up the grid.
If you put me in your video, I'm just gonna...
No, video and buckle.
Yep, beef and buckle.
Can you be more relaxed?
Centre.
While Townsons are well known for their lovely lines, this also includes their keel, which creates a slightly troublesome tendency to want to nosedive when they're in the cradle.
What about this one?
The keel has a very nice curve to it, which means that all the load of the boat needs to rest on right on the rear point of the keel. So you can see us sitting very much at the back end of the boat while we wait for things to be stabilised underneath. I'm not sure that the solution that was chosen was the one I would tend to recommend. However, we made it up the ramp intact and ended up in position ready for work to commence. This video is logically sequenced, not chronologically sequenced, so you can see all the different jobs in the order that makes the most sense. As soon as she was on the hard, we stripped her down for storage and for safety while she was on the hard while we were away for a trip. This included all running rigging, sails, and we also stripped the safety lines, the pull pit and push pit. While this was a fairly laborious task, we got it out of the way early because we knew we had to do this to remove the edges of the deck, and it also made it much easier to snug her down and store her securely while we were away on holiday and keep her waterproof so she could dry out. can see in the shot of the last stanchion being removed that the deck underneath it was very soft. We were having trouble with leaking in the boat, and this was one of the main culprits around the base of these stanchions, and it also caused the softening around the edges of the decks. Our primary focus during this time on the hard was the hull and the edges of the decks, but we did do some interior work as well. This included removing the compressor system for the old fridge in the boat. We had also been having a few minor overheating issues with the engine, so I stripped down the water pump, found that there'd been significant calcium build-up and the impeller had lost a number of its blades, so I rebuilt the water pump, new backing plate, new impeller, and decalcified it, and it's effectively as good as new now. Amanda also painted the inside of the boat with bilge coat, a very thick and oil and water resistant paint that makes it much easier to keep the inside of the boat clean and dry. While working on the interior of the boat, I decided to take out one of the interior through-hull fittings to see what its condition was, and it started breaking down as I was taking it out of the boat, so I made the decision to replace all of these old brass fittings with modern ABS plastic equivalents. As I mentioned earlier, there was a tight spot in the rudder, so I pulled the rudder out, and whilst it was out I noticed there was a slight crack in the fiberglass around the base of the rudder tube. So after doing a bit more investigation there, I discovered that one of the bolts retaining the rudder tube had rotted out, so I pulled the rudder tube out, rebuilt the area of the keelson around it, and replaced all the bolts and refitted the rudder tube. After repairing and waterproofing around the rudder tube, we refitted the rudder in another attempt to try and find the tight spot. After many hours and several refittings of the rudder, we still haven't got to the bottom of the tight spot. The first day of refitting and testing didn't reveal anything, but on the second day I spent a long day of measuring and marking everything on the rudder. After doing this, I discovered that the bottom of the rudder was slightly off centre, showing that the rudder had clearly taken a fairly serious impact at some point in its life, and the shaft was not straight. So after several local experiments of persuading it straight with a large sledgehammer and a vice, the rudder was taken to an engineering shop where they straightened it using far heavier presses and heat. The straightening work by the engineers had exacerbated a crack along the front of the rudder, so I decided to take it home and re-glue the leading edge and re-fiberglass the rudder. One of the other things I'd noticed when we had been sailing the boat was that the winches were in need of a bit of a rebuild, so I brought them home and stripped them down and greased and rebuilt them. Amanda had also brought home the cockpit gratings and glued and rebuilt these, and then I varnished them as well. We had also bought a new integrated instrument system, including a through-hull fitting with depth, temperature and speed in the one fitting. There is also a full set of masthead instruments as well, but these will be fitted at a later date.
We spent about 5 months working on the boat. We'd head down to the club after work for a few hours. Our weekends were spent working on the boat, including our 3-week holiday break, when the New Zealand Christmas tree, the Pahutakawa, comes into full bloom. We'd watch the yachts come in from the Thursday night races, knowing that we had months of work ahead of us before we could sail up the Tamaki River. On the 5th of January, the skies turned an eerie orange as the smoke from the Australian bushfires came across Auckland, fooling the seagulls into thinking it was dusk at about 3 p.m. They landed on the beach and put their heads under their wings. It is a beautiful location though. We'd often watch the pretty light come across the river as the sun set and the moon came up over Rangitoto.
The deckwork began with removing the tow rails, revealing a significantly wet deck edge. At first I tried to route back a limited amount of the deck edge to reduce the amount of deck replacement required. This showed it really needed a more extensive repair, so in the end we cut it back about 4 inches or 100mm. After trying several different methods, I found a very cheap but very effective plunge saw at the hardware store, which made a very significant difference to the amount of time required to remove the deck pieces, which was then denailed and descrewed and planed back to a flush surface to allow for drying and for better glue bonding. The new deck pieces were lap jointed, which would have been strong enough. However, preferring to over-engineer rather than under-engineer, I put in backing plates as well to reinforce the joint area, making these areas probably twice as strong as any other area on the deck. Installing these backing plates was a 2-person job with Amanda inside the boat in some fairly awkward areas to hold them in place, while I glued and screwed from the outside. Oftentimes we worked on different pieces of the job, getting very good at coinciding our work effort for the moments in time where we needed to work together. Even so, there were many nights where we still ended up working into the gathering darkness. One of the other challenges with this deck work was trying to keep the boat dry, often with the rain around. This was a significant challenge and sometimes unsuccessful, but generally we got very good at keeping the boat watertight and shipshape while we worked on the decks. Cutting and fitting the replacement deck edge was a bit of a black art. Early in the project I tried to measure and cut accurately prior to offering up and checking. However, in the end it proved to be easier to just guesstimate and trim back. The losses using this approach were probably no more than when I'd been trying to measure accurately in the first place, and were much more time effective. This part of the project was great legwork, with many trips up and down the ladder to offer up, fit, check, trim, plane and recut. Once this was done, it also needed to be edge routed for the lap joints to fit the deck pieces in place. Once the deck pieces were the right size, we glued these down with a glue made of epoxy resin and West Systems 413 hardener. This proved to be brutally strong but also quite easy to work, making a great combination. We were very generous with the use of this glue mixture, as it added a lot of strength to the boat and means that the deck should probably not need any attention for a long time into the future. Once the pieces were fitted, we fiberglassed these as well, using double layers of fiberglass fabric and fairly generous resin amounts here as well, and then filled using a resin and microbead filler and fed back. Then it was around to the port side and rinse and repeat. During the course of the deck work, I was up and down the ladder regularly to adjust the uprights on the cradle, only realising worryingly late in the piece that I could actually put packer plates in behind them and not need to do this at all.
Spending so much time at the yard, you get to meet heaps of people and share the trials and tribulations of boat ownership. We watched a number of boats come into the yard, have the work completed and be launched again. One of them was this 36-foot Herreshoff, owned by Rick and Rose, an amazingly generous couple who helped many of the other boat owners with their questions and ideas, and many late night sessions discussing the pros and cons of varying boat coatings. This was the third time they'd launched. Unfortunately, they took on quite a bit of water the first 2 times, and in the end they had to replace some caulking. Third time successful. Tui was really interested to watch all the other boats going into the water, just to see the balance. The Tamaki River runs really fast, and even at high tide there is quite a pull. And we watched boats struggle out of the cradle. You always worried about the beautiful paint job you just finished would be scuffed on those poles. We learnt a lot and we made some great friends. We watched some beautiful boats go into the water, including this 34-foot Townson. I think this one had a near perfect launch, one of the very few of the many we saw. Every day at the club meant we'd be backwards and forwards between the boat and home, sometimes a few times a day to get supplies. Often we'd stop on the way home for takeaways because we'd worked so hard we had no energy for cooking.
Originally, when she came onto the hard, we'd only intended to strip back and tidy up the anti-foul, re-anti-foul, and put the hull back into the water. It quickly became apparent that this wasn't going to be the case, with some visible weeping around an old depth down the fitting, that when it was removed, there was evidence that there had been water getting in behind it. There was also a repair on the keelson just after the bow that, when examined, revealed that the fiberglass had failed and there had been water getting in behind this as well. There was also rebuild work needed done on the skeg. Overall, there were quite a number of issues, so the call was made that we would strip it right back to the wood and re-fiberglass. In researching how to strip the paint, we found a product called Peel Away, which you paint on as a gel paste and then coat in an airproof paper and leave for several days for it to act on the paint. This was probably significantly easier than stripping by any conventional means, but the key advantage it had was that the paint came off as a gel paste as well, rather than as powder or flakes, making it much safer and easier to manage in the yard and easier to clean up. Stripping revealed a very well built and sound hull, though still very wet in some places. Though most of the discoloration you can see here is the resin used in the original build of the boat, prior to what appears to be a fairly significant rebuild fairly early in its life. This is the repair of the sounder fitting mount. This was cleaned out and cut back to sound wood. A plug was made to go in the original hole, and then a cap made to fit and glued in and faired over. The hull was dried out and extensively everdured, and by the time it was reglassed and put back in the water, it was in much better condition than it had probably been for a number of years. Once the paint was stripped, the hull was found to be in generally very good condition. We did attempt to reuse the fiberglass that was on the hull at the time, but after a number of tests with how well the resin could be rebonded, we decided to strip it back to the wood and re-fiberglass, which proved to be hard work, but in the end proved to be the right decision to make. This sanding back of the glass was many hours of very, very hard work. There was no easy way to do this, but it did give the wood the chance to breathe for probably the first time in 40 years. And dry out. And you can see we've chased the moisture out with thinners and followed up with Everdur. And by the time we were re-glassing the hull, the woodwork was looking in much better condition, and probably as good as it's been in many years. And you could really see the beautiful colouring of the wood coming through under the resin, which seemed a great shame to cover and paint an anti-foul. But we were looking forward to a much stronger boat after a fresh couple of coats of fiberglass. The fiberglassing was often a 2 or even 3 person job, with the cutting, holding and resining of the fiberglass and trying to get it to sit right on the hull. We certainly developed tricks and techniques over the course of the job to help deal with working with fiberglass, but there were certainly many times when it seemed to have an absolute mind of its own, trying to get it in a position to match with the previous piece of fiberglass. The hull was glassed in 2 layers of fabric, with the first layer of fabric going fore to aft as it dropped, and the second layer going aft to fore as it dropped, and everywhere the fabric crossed over a previous layer, I inserted a small patch of much lighter fiberglass to make sure that it was perfectly sealed. Around the top of the keel it was 6 to 8 layers thick to allow for maximum strength in the boat. Between each layer we would re-resin and then sand back to make sure that the next layer of glass would have the maximum chance to bond to the underlying layer. As you can see, the wood came up beautifully through the resin, and when it was finished it looked like it was a layer of golden glass. Unfortunately we had to sand back the final coat and to allow for the paint to adhere strongly to the resin. Again, this piece of the project involved lots of sanding and dusting and tidying and cleaning between each coat. You can see here the final layer of glass going on. Before a final resin coat over the top of the glass to allow for the Interprotect paint to have the best chance to bond to the underlying surface. Here you can see the final resin coat going on prior to the Interprotect, and after this resin coat it just looks fantastic. Followed by the ubiquitous sanding to rough up the surface. Here you can see the first layer of the Interprotect going on, a 2-pot epoxy skinning paint for the maximum protection for the hull. You can see Rick and Rose join the party here, who were a great help throughout the build of this boat. We effectively just painted around and around the boat with the next coat ready to go on by the time we had finished the previous coat. There was 3 coats put on at this point. As we ran out of Interprotect after 3 coats, we had to let that cure off and sand it back so that the final coats could key into it properly. If you don't sand it back quickly, it develops an extremely hard outer coating. There are some great guide coat products available, but in this case we used a tip from Rick to break a marker pen into some thinners, making a great wash to act as a guide coat. The purpose of this guide coat is so that you can see how far you've sanded back, so you just take the skin off the paint and no more. The next step was to mark up the waterline, and after a few failed attempts of doing it the old-fashioned way by eye, I decided to buy a cheap laser level, which proved to be absolutely brilliant for doing the job with. And in the end, our guesstimate waterline proved to be within half an inch of correct. We did momentarily borrow the neighbour's boat as a mount for the laser level to get round the difficult corners of the stern of the hull. Then it was onto the final coats of Interprotect. These were left tacky so that the anti-foul could key into the still soft Interprotect, making for a much stronger bond between the anti-foul and the underlying paint. Amanda chose the colour, and it went on a very pretty dark teal colour. In the water it's unfortunately lost a little bit of its colour, but it's still a very pretty change from the original traditional red anti-foul. This part of the project felt like we were making very good progress and was very satisfying to do. Here's the final coat of anti-foul going on. It did feel like there should be a little bit of a ceremony for the removing of the masking tape, revealing the freshly painted anti-foul and making the boat look absolutely fantastic. It was then remasked for some touch-up painting of the white above the waterline. This wasn't a matched colour, this was simply painted to seal the boat back up for a season of sailing before we bring her out and do the upper hull and cabin tops on our next phase of the project. Here she is, ready to go back in the water and looking fantastic. We did have some very small helpers turn up during the course of the project. Here's one trying to hotwire the forklift.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, she pulled
Oh, both of you hoed into it.
Yeah.
Oh shit.
Same with the willet on the other little trigger there.
Yeah.
Here she is being moved to the launching grid. This was, for me, very hard to watch. Watching the many hours of hard work teetering on the cradle as she was moved across the yard. There were times when I just simply had to look away. You can still see masking tape on the hull at this point as we did our last coat of the white paint in the hours before she went back down the ramp into the water. After an urgent refit of a couple of cleats at the back of the boat so we could tie her to the wharf, it was loading a few things back on to help with the launch, and down the ramp she went. And after watching numerous other stressful launches and being quite nervous about my launch myself, our launch went absolutely without a hitch, and the motor fired up immediately and the water pumps and everything worked. We smoothly moved out of the cradle, had a little motor up and down the river, and then pulled up alongside the wharf. There is still a lot more of this project to go. A lot of this can be done while she's on the water, either on the mooring or by pulling alongside the wharf. So we will be working through this as well as sailing her as much as possible, and then possibly bringing her up next winter to do the interior and the upper hull and cabin tops in a controlled environment. Other than that, we now have a very pretty boat back on the water, though you'll notice in that last shot, no winches. When these are refitted and with our new set of sails that are due to arrive shortly, and as soon as the COVID-19 restrictions are lifted, we'll be ready to head straight back out into the Gulf and take her on many more adventures.